welcome to this event. I'm Giovanni Zanalda, the director of the Duke Center for International Global Studies, and I Duke Center for International Global Studies, together with Daniel Bessner and Matthew Spector, organized this event. And this is a roundtable, so it's not a roundtable physically, but it's a roundtable at least in our imagination. And I would like to start by introducing the speakers. The order is that I will introduce the first four speakers who are going to present their ideas about the main topic of this roundtable. And then the other speakers who are going to comment on the first remarks, and then we will go back and forth, and we will open the room for questions. And it's going to be, should be a lively debate, so especially from the audience, feel free to ask questions after the first round of questions of the roundtable. And you can ask questions to all the panelists or to a panelist in particular, or you can also comment with your own ideas about the main topic of this roundtable. So the title is Realism and Liberal Internationalism After Trump. Now I would say after Trump is not because we know that Trump is leaving sooner or later, but it's just because we think in the long run, the world is going on, and we are going to have new presidents, etc. So it's important to think about this in a sort of historical perspective. The future of U.S. foreign policy in transatlantic perspective, and again, this is important because some of our guest speakers are, their specialty is really transatlantic history or relationships and diplomatic history of the transatlantic world. So we should capitalize on that. Also, we do have in the audience several speakers who are they are here for a workshop that we are going to have tomorrow. It's a small workshop that it's more research oriented. So we will, of course, I'm sure that they will ask questions or write their own comments to what our presenters are going to say first. So I will start with the first four speakers. So Matthew Spector, who is, he got his PhD in history here at Duke, so welcome back. And he's currently a visiting research scholar at the Center for International Global Studies and a lecturer at the Department of History and Program in International Studies at UC Berkeley. His book, first book was Habermas, an Intellectual Biography, which was the first biography of Habermas by a historian, which was widely reviewed and translated into Spanish and Turkish. And his forthcoming book, which is very relevant for what we are going to talk tonight, is about Atlantic Realism, Political Thought and Foreign Policy, 1819-1980. And that is published with Stanford University Press. The second speaker will be Katharina Ritzler. She's a lecturer at the Department of History and Center for American Studies at the University of Sussex. Her main research interest is internationalism and its social, political, economic, and legal dimensions from the 1910s to the 1960s. Currently, she's working on a book manuscript on American philanthropy and conceptions of the international in the first half of the 20th century, which is a study based on multilingual research in European and American archives, which examines philanthropic internationalism in a transnational context. The third speaker is Alexandra Kemmerer. She's a senior research fellow and head of the Berlin office of the Max Planck Institute for Public International Law. And she has, of course, a background and interest in legal history. The fourth speaker is Daniel Bessner, who is also here, a Duke alumnus. He also got his PhD here at Duke, and so welcome back. And he's the Kenneth Pyle Assistant Professor of U.S. Foreign Relations at the Jackson School of International Affairs at University of Washington. So as we can see, our graduate students did very well. And And his work, he works on intellectual and cultural history, US foreign relations, the history of democratic thought, and the history of the social sciences. He's the author of Democracy in Exile, Hans Speer and the Rise of the Defense Intellectual, which was published by Cornell University Press in 2018. Now we get to the more local speakers, and the first person who will comment on the first four speakers is Joe Grieco, who is professor of political science here at Duke University. And the second will be Malachi Hakonen, who is professor of history also at Duke University. Then we have Simon Miles, assistant professor in the Stanford School of Public Policy. And then last but not least is Patrick Duddy, who is a former US ambassador to Venezuela. He's a senior visiting scholar here at Duke. He's also advisor for the Office of Global Affairs and the director of the Duke Center for International, Duke Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. So welcome and thank you for being here. And Matthew will be the first speaker. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Giovanni. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to initiate this conversation. There have been basically three major schools of US foreign policy theory and practice since World War II: the realist, the liberal internationalist, and the neoconservative. There's also a significant critical or dissenting tradition of anti-war, anti-imperialism, and anti-militarism that began to take shape in the late 1950s and Vietnam War, but this fourth tradition never really developed into a robust theory and practice of US foreign policy. The Iraq War debacle of George W. Bush and Cheney made the Bush 41 team of realists, Scowcroft and Powell, look prescient. Realism, including the writings of Hans Morgenthau, came back into vogue. That the Iraq fiasco of Bush Jr. reflected well on the realists was a kind of optical illusion, obscuring its own profound inadequacies. Now we're at risk of succumbing to a second distortion of perspective, namely that the nihilism and adhocracy of Trump might convince us that Obama's liberal internationalism is the ne plus ultra of US foreign policy. Obama and Clinton staffers in exile wishing to rotate into power if a Democrat captures the presidency would be a step forward, of course, but Clinton-Obama nostalgia masks the present crisis, which I would argue is much deeper than the Trump administration's incompetence, self-dealing, or suspect relationship to Putin's Russia. Trump is better seen as a symptom of a broader breakdown in consensus on the rules of international economic and political order, not its cause. If we frame the Trump question as one of simply defending the so-called rules-based, US-led liberal international order, we will miss the rarest of opportunities that we now have to rethink the US role in the world. So, a few thoughts on realism. The philosophy of realism in foreign affairs was popularized in the US in the 1940s and 50s by figures like the German émigrés, Hans Morgenthau, John Hertz, Arnold Wolfers, the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, and Russia specialist George Kennan. Of the three leading traditions of post-war US foreign policy thought, the realist has dominated, becoming nearly synonymous with the new post-war discipline of international relations. Can Trump claim the mantle of realist? One could note the affinity between his acceptance of Russia's annexation of Crimea. One could note the affinity between his acceptance of Russia's annexation of Crimea and John Mearsheimer's argument that the West sowed what it reaped in Crimea when it pushed for NATO enlargement in the 1990s. Trump's America First rhetoric appears to have translated into a drawdown of American forces in Afghanistan and Syria. He used the term principled realism in his State of the Union, a phrase borrowed from the author of his national security strategy. But we know better than to ascribe ideological coherence, let alone grand strategy vision, to Mr. Trump. While Trump, with the help of Steve Bannon, positioned himself as the tribune of a nationalist populist revolt against elite-driven globalization, some conservative intellectuals see in him an inchoate realism, good realist instincts that might be coaxed into more articulate form. The appointment of neoconservative Elliot Abrams to be his point man on Venezuela, however, shows that there is little hope of making a coherent realist of Trump. But all of this introduction begs the question of what we mean by realism today. Today, in an establishment organ like Foreign Affairs magazine, realist and liberal internationalist perspectives overlap significantly, forming part of an interventionist consensus on the rights and responsibilities of U.S. power or empire conceived as benevolent hegemon. The convergence of realism and liberal internationalism into what Washington, D.C. affectionately calls the blob is fortunate because for too long, realists were able to caricature liberalism as an innocent, blind to the workings of power, and liberals to disavow power politics as something only the realists believed in. But realism has never been the diametrical opposite of liberal internationalism. I'll expand on that in discussion. And today's establishment agrees on the unique role the U.S. has in preserving the liberal world order, providing global public goods like freedom of the seas, financial stability, freer trade, the rules outlined by the UN Charter. Where the realists and liberals seem to disagree is more of a matter of emphasis. Is supporting this order the primary goal of U.S. foreign policy? Or is it desirable only to the extent that it does not conflict with specific national interests as the realists interpret them? Underlying the answers to this question is another question. Is the U.S. unique or exceptional in world history? The answers of the partisans of the American century, the phrase made famous by Time and Life magazine founder Henry Luce in 1941, was that the 20th century would be the American century because the U.S. was uniquely chosen by Providence to realize a certain destiny. To this question, is the U.S. unique? Liberal internationalists say yes. The U.S. is exceptionally willing and able to self-bind, to renounce its hegemony in a self-binding or self-renunciation. Neoconservatives also say yes. The U.S. has a unique duty to spread American-style capitalism and democracy. One model for all societies, and we are it. The great power realists say no. We're no different than Russia or China today, an empire seeking our share of wealth, power, and influence. And finally, the dissenting realists, who I'm calling the dissenting realists or progressives, no, we're not exceptional. We, the U.S., are as much at risk of losing our republic to empire as other republics in history. We have to learn from these failures. So, in conclusion, I believe that we're left with a choice between two realisms. If realism signifies the naturalization of great power rivalry, the primacy of the national interest narrowly conceived, and a commitment to maximize both hard and soft power for a competitive national struggle for primacy in the international system, then no, I don't think realism offers anything of value today. If realism, however, signifies restraint, prudence, caution, facilitates critiques of mistakes like the Vietnam War, as it did for George Kennan and Hans Morgenthau, and shows an interest in international institution building and the need to ensure that we do not build legal or normative castles in the air, then yes, realism has a future. We err if we interpret the populist nationalist revolt as augur of a necessary return to the traditional 19th century great power rivalries, and an end to the illusions of American unipolarity without challengers. Instead, we should take advantage of these cracks in the interventionist, liberal internationalist consensus to begin pursuing a synthesis of the salvageable parts of both liberal internationalism and realism. Thank you.
Thank you. Katharina.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here to Duke. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I'll follow on from those remarks, but I'll reflect more specifically on a category that is common to both realism and liberal internationalism. We've already heard that there are a lot of overlaps, and I think a concern with the category of the public is another one of those. This category affects many liberal democracies, especially those that are facing a populist challenge right now and a perceived crisis of democratic truth, as well as a perceived need to make a foreign policy that is more in tune with the people. So I'm coming to this panel with the perspective of a German historian working in Britain, and we are about to exit the European Union, possibly in a very disorderly fashion. And of course, this is a momentous moment because EU membership has shaped the British economy, British society, diplomacy, and also arguably security for the last 46 years. So the decision to leave the EU, which was based on a consultative referendum, which is well known, has profound implications. And to just give you one example from the higher education sector, a no-deal Brexit may well mean that British universities will, from 2020, no longer be able to participate in many higher education programs funded by the EU. And one of those is the Erasmus program, which is a pan-European educational exchange program, and that has been a big success story, especially for British universities. And also for the idea of European understanding, the idea that it is important to forge cross-border contacts and create something that gives a space to ordinary people to connect. And this is a very typical, classic, liberal internationalist shibboleth, that it is important to build these kinds of spaces. So losing access to such programs is just one small way in which Brexit is likely to upend some very long-held liberal internationalist traditions in British foreign policy. So for many academics, such as myself, and also for many pundits, this is a truly depressing result, not least because so many of the promises made to voters in 2016 were, well, shall we say, not based on facts. Experts predicted that all these problems that we're seeing now, such as the problems of the Irish border, customs, a drain of foreign investment, that these things would happen, but these predictions didn't matter. In the words of the pro-Brexit British politician Gisela Stewart, who incidentally is a fellow German immigrant, I quote, "There's only one expert that matters, and that is you, the voter." And indeed, the British referendum on Brexit is a real paradox, because it wasn't just a feast of falsehoods, it was also the most significant revitalization of democratic politics in Britain for a generation. You could argue that. Over 2 million non-voters, people who usually do not vote, are estimated to have turned out. And these were people who had given up on the democratic process. And for these people, the referendum was a chance and an attractive way to make their voices heard. So if liberal internationalism is also about bringing foreign policy closer to the people, in this case, the consequences were somewhat self-defeating. But I think the broader context of the referendum is also a historical crisis in the relationship between democracy and truth, in the words of historian Sophia Rosenfeld. If a functioning democracy needs both the intelligence of the masses and well-informed experts, both the Brexit referendum and also Donald Trump's denigration of expert elites highlight the strength of the current anti-technocratic backlash. So in this new, more populist age, the idea to craft a people's foreign policy seems attractive, and not just on the right, but also on the left of the political spectrum. And this has been articulated on the left of the Democratic Party in America, but also among conservatives in Britain and in Europe. But what would such a people's foreign policy look like? Well, concerns about the relationship between publics, experts, and foreign policy are obviously not new. Foreign policy represents the most arcane area of policy making, the most complicated one, and indeed these concerns were very common across liberal democracies in the first half of the 20th century. These concerns were dealt with both theoretically and also more practically. So theorists of international relations dealt with this in various ways. For example, there was a very sophisticated stream of scholarship that analyzed plebiscites and referenda. So in the years after World War I, it was commonly assumed that foreign policy, because it was so complicated, could absolutely never be made the subject of a referendum. Scholars who wrote on this question included Pittman Potter, Sarah Womble, and Raymond Leslie Buell. So they did portray public opinion as inadequate, but also as important. The interwar years are also interesting because they were a time of inventive experiments that are, I think, worth revisiting. Interwar international theorists sought both to educate and to counsel. So they developed public outreach programs such as specialist libraries, information services, and also discussion clubs. And I don't want to go into this in more detail, but I can later if anybody wants me to. But I think these are worth revisiting today because they represent genuine attempts to connect, as I've already said, the people and foreign policy. So this is worth going back to, especially because we are in a new age of anxiety over the rise of post-liberal subjectivities and also forms of governance that bring in a post-democratic age. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for having me here. The last time around at Duke, I came for an editorial board meeting of the German Law Journal at Duke Law School, which in itself is also kind of transnational endeavor and could be seen as an expression of a very liberal understanding of transnational legal cooperation and comparative law. I'm of course commenting here from the point of view of an international lawyer, of an international European lawyer with historical and theoretical interests, and I have to say that these last weeks have been quite trying times for someone who's in the field of international law. If we look at the activities of the U.S. government, the withdrawal from the INF Treaty, of course, which has been announced, which might signify a return to a new era of nuclear warfare, nuclear weapons competition, and also kind of return to a Cold War setting in a fashion that we didn't really think about for the last decades. The announced withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, but also the politics of President Trump towards the ICC, and an approach to international law where foreign policy is not even justified or voiced in international law terminology. If we look at President Trump's announcements following the attacks and the use of force in Syria, we realize that in his tweets there was not even made reference to any kind of normative justification or legitimation. And that, even if we take into account, and I would agree in that regard with Matthew Spector, that we cannot say that's entirely a shift or a break with continuities that were already established in the Bush and Obama era. That, I think, is still not just a gradual difference, but it's a turn from the very language and the very conceptual system of a structure of world order that has been established after 1945. So I will try to contextualize these current developments within the long durée of post-1945 international law. But before doing so, I would like to discuss a more recent argument, which, as we will see, is also related to these developments. As President Trump has reached, President Trump's first term has just reached its midpoint, I would like to discuss Harold Koh's argument that he has just made in his most recent book, International Law in the era of in the Trump era. His argument that the 45th president's various initiatives have not profoundly changed the nature of the United States' relationship with international law and its institutions, but Koh argues they have triggered the strategic use of technique of an ongoing transnational legal process as a means to preserve and even improve a Kantian vision of post-war global governance. So how so? Harold Koh, the Dean of Yale Law School, brings a number of examples that justify his claim and his view. One example for the kind of transnational legal process that he sees as a kind of counter-strategy or counter-movement towards a turn from international law that can be seen on the government side is the litigation which has been brought against the so-called Muslim ban to U.S. courts. But I wonder whether such a form and whether such instruments of transnational legal process and involving actors on the national level but also on the international level, inside and outside the United States, can really be seen as an antidote to an endangered situation for international law within a nation that has been this indispensable nation for global order since the end of the Second World War. While Koh offers a very pointed descriptive analysis, but also a forceful normative plea for legal counter-strategies that provide such an antidote to authoritarian populist and anti-globalist forces in the US and beyond, against the backdrop of the current shifts and ruptures, this is also an update of a concept of transnational legal cooperation and legal process, which has been developed in the 1990s and draws heavily from a perception of the early days of Cold War international law as seen from the 1989 perspective that seems quite deficient. It seems deficient because of this trend really to do without international law, without normative references, without relying on discursive tools and discursive structures that have been established since 1945 and under the leadership of the United States as the power guaranteeing and driving these processes. Driving these processes in politics, but also driving these processes academically, scholarly, by providing spaces and providing networks, creating supporting networks that have been vital for the establishment of a system of international law that turned out to be a backbone for a quite stable international order despite all its shortcomings for many years. So can such a counter-strategy of international legal process, transnational legal process, be revived and further developed in the United States, but also in other geopolitical settings? If we look to Eastern Europe, to Venezuela, to Brazil today, then this seems quite dubious whether this is possible, and I think it's just wishful nostalgia and a kind of subtle reminder of an outdated liberal vision in an age of neorealism. If we assume that just by reviving and strengthening international institutions, international courts, we can go back to a kind of mid-90s vision of what international order and international law is all about. What we see in the United States, what we see also in various parts of Europe, what we see now in Venezuela, in other parts of the global south, is a profound tension of democracy and the rule of law. And while I would want to believe that attempts and approaches to kind of citizen foreign policy, as outlined by Katharina in her presentation, could be an antidote to these tendencies, I'm still rather doubtful. And I'm also doubtful because this tension is an inherent part of the international order that we have established since the end of the Second World War. It has been dealt with many scholars who engage with global order, United Nations structures, but also the emerging European Union and the system of European legal integration. And we can see that at the core of this, of their attempts to deal with this inherent tension, there was also always a struggle between liberal and realist visions. But oftentimes, these approaches were merged into what you could call either an idealist realism, or you could also call it a more realist international liberalism. And I think what might be crucial today would be to create spaces and to leave open, and also to revisit these traditions of a merger of these theoretical schools and theoretical positions, in order to create new spaces where we can find solutions that lead us out of this trap of being trapped in a situation where we see only a possibility of choice between strong strict realism and a strong idealist or liberal vision of what future world order, what future world orders could be.
Alexander. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sure.
Daniel, I want just to say Daniel is going to be the last of the long speakers, because then we are going to have comments.
Good, and don't worry, it won't be too long. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming today, and Giovanni and Amanda, especially, and Nancy for helping to plan the conference. And I'd like to say, Matthew and I are not just alumna of Duke, but our Doktorvater, Malachi Hakon, is both of our Doktorvater is on the panel, so it's a pleasure to, I think this is my first panel with Malachi, so it's about time. So Donald Trump, I believe, is most interesting not for what he has done in the field of foreign relations. In my opinion, he has, for the most part, remained relatively true to the commitments and assumptions that have defined the American empire and U.S. hegemony since about 1945. But Trump is interesting for the space that he's opened up for Americans, both intellectuals and the public alike, to reconsider some of the fundamental assumptions about America's role in the world that have guided their thinking at this point for decades. The shock of Trump's victory, in short, is an emperor has no clothes moment, in which Americans have been finally forced to deal with the fact that the bargain of unilateralist imperial hegemony, made in the hopeful years after the traumas of World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II, might not be worth the costs. The general disillusionment with American foreign policy was, I believe, reflected in the fact that one of Trump's favorite things to do as a presidential candidate, primarily because it evoked such enthusiastic responses, and Trump's genius, I think, is one as a rhetorician. He's a brilliant rhetorician, and also his ability to feel the pulse of society. So Trump really recognized what was going on, and one of his favorite things to do was to criticize the American foreign policy establishment for its myriad post-9/11 failures. During his primary campaign, Trump stood out, for example, from a crowded Republican field by excoriating the Iraq War, and he repeated his criticism in every general election debate. Then, as president-elect, he discredited the expertise of U.S. intelligence agencies by stating, quote, "These are the same people who said Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction," end quote. Trump realized more acutely than most that the American public has neither forgotten nor forgiven the establishment's role in initiating one of the longest and most fruitless wars in U.S. history. Indeed, the foreign policy establishment has in general lost the legitimacy it enjoyed for much of the Cold War and post-Cold War eras. Take, for example, the letter from August 2016, signed by 50 Republican national security officials which opposed Trump's bid for the presidency. Does anyone remember this letter? Probably not, because it sank without a trace within days of its release. The public had, and indeed has, no desire to heed the so-called experts, especially when these experts fail to seriously account for the disasters from Afghanistan to Iraq to Libya to Syria, which have characterized U.S. foreign policy for 20 years. The total failure of the establishment to hold itself accountable has been most recently reflected, in my opinion, in the calls to reestablish a so-called liberal international order that analysts from the Brookings Institution to the Council on Foreign Relations to the Center for American Progress claim structured world politics throughout what one might call the short American century, the period from 1945 to 2016. And just to paraphrase, I think it's Sam Moyn who said this, the liberal international order was neither liberal nor international nor an order. And I think that's roughly correct. In my opinion, in fact, to advocate for a liberal international order is to engage in profoundly ahistorical and nostalgic reasoning. As recent scholarship by Paul Chamberlain and Daniel Immerwahr, as many others as well, demonstrates beyond the shadow of a doubt, the Cold War was hardly the long peace that some analysts, most notably John Lewis Gaddis, claimed it was in the 1980s and 1990s. Rather, tens of millions of people, primarily of course in the global south and therefore mostly outside the American imagination, fell victim to two superpowers engaged in a narcissistic struggle for hegemony and domination. While the Cold War may have worked out pretty well for the nations of the North Atlantic, it was certainly terrible for most of the world. And in fact, I think it's worth questioning in 2019 whether the Cold War was even that great for people living in the United States. Sure, it was pretty good for defense manufacturers, the military, and pundits who never met a war they didn't like, but did it really have a positive influence on the lives of ordinary Americans? Since the 1970s at least, inequality within the United States has increased. Moreover, the burden of fighting America's wars has unsurprisingly fallen, as former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates declared in one of his final speeches, actually given at Duke. The burden of America's wars, fighting these wars, has unsurprisingly fallen on the United States' most impoverished communities. As this suggests, the liberal international order that so many in the establishment want to return to was defined by an oppression that took a variety of forms, both within and without the United States. If this is what the foreign policy establishment is defending, it's no surprise that there has been a loss of faith and expertise amongst the American public. Indeed, it's my opinion that today several of the most important questions of foreign policy actually don't lie abroad but lie at home. Since at least 1945, U.S. foreign policy has been made by a small group of non-elected elites ensconced in executive agencies and free from public and congressional accountability. Given that the United States is entering a new geopolitical era defined not by unipolarity and hegemony, but by multilateralism and power sharing, it might be time for analysts to rethink how U.S. foreign policy is made. How can we ensure U.S. foreign policy making is more democratic, as Katerina suggests? How can we guarantee that foreign policymakers are held to professional and, in some cases, legal account? These are critical questions that foreign policy thinkers who for too long have focused on the world and not the United States must begin to address in earnest. Thank you.